everybody. Today's a little different because I had to have a oral surgery yesterday in my mouth, and so I'm not actually supposed to be talking, but I'm going to try to talk softly. That's why I have this microphone. Hopefully you can hear me okay. I'm going to try not to talk very much. All right. So today we're going to get to discussing your results. And, last week we had a presentation about, how to present your data visually, and that's important. As I mentioned last week, I can't really talk about your individual results. I can talk to you about presenting them, which is why we had a guest speaker who is really good about talking about that. Now we're going to get to the discussion of that. And the discussion of results is an area that kind of covers just about every scientific discipline. So today I want to talk about that. What is the discussion section? I also want to look at a little bit from the last week's homework. We're going to look at that a little bit more today. And we're going to connect those things between the figures and how that connects to the discussion. And then finally, please stay online as at the end, I really want to go into a little bit more detail about what's going to be expected about your final assessment, especially since that now has changed a little bit for a number of reasons, which I'll explain later. All right. So I asked you to critique the elementos gráficos, as Professora Luana puts it in that article that we've looked at a little bit about how people smell if they eat too much meat. Most of you came to the same conclusion, that figure 1, as this person here says, figure 1, there are numerous data that should be described in a table, but instead is demonstrated in graphs. In figure 2, there is no label with the value nor the sign if they have statistical difference or not. So they didn't like either figure. Everybody said pretty much the same thing. Interesting data, yes, okay, but poorly presented. Figure 1 shows very close columns, making difficult to visualize. And that'd be better in a table. And this is exactly what Professor Luana was talking about. There are certain data that is actually better in a table than in a graph. And just because you put it in a graph doesn't make it more impactful. She said that I like the presentation in columns as in figure 2, but I believe that some relevant information such as significance was poorly presented. I also believe that this figure would be unnecessary since the author shows the same information in table 1, which is true. So it kind of, you get to that point, you're kind of confused. Okay, so how is this different from what was presented in table 1? And it isn't really. And so in fact, it's a good example. Here you have figure 1 with the columns very close and confusing. The y-axis is not clear. And then you have in figure 2, a really good example of what Professor Luana was talking about, where some people believe that if you put these box plots or other kinds of graphs up, that it can make a better impact. In this case, I would agree with what many of the students said, which is that it doesn't seem to be really necessary. And so ultimately it led to confusion because table 1 seems to have the same data. Why is it presented visually this way? It doesn't really make that much of a difference. So that was just a really good example of exactly what she was talking about. And I hope that her talk at least provoked reflection. Even if you don't have any data yet to present visually, when you get to that stage, maybe you'll be thinking about it in a different way. You're probably wondering why I have a bowl of chili in this picture. And really this photograph is to remind me of the first time I tried to make chili. I must have been, in my early 20s, one of the first times I was living on my own, I guess. And I had some guests coming over to my apartment, and I decided that I was going to make chili. And back then, there was no internet, and I didn't have any recipe books, so I didn't want to go out and buy or borrow any. And I thought to myself, well, how hard can this actually be to make a bowl of chili? What does chili have? And I thought to myself, well, chili's got, what, beans? And I think I know how to cook beans. And it's got some meat in it, at least the kind that I eat, what they call in the States, the chili con carne. And I guess that, and some onions, I suppose. And of course, that's totally off. Today, when I cook chili, it's actually got a lot more to it. And there are different stages to the cooking process. I don't want to get into a chili recipe right now. But now I know what goes into chili. So when I didn't, back then, the first time I made chili, I served it up, and it did not meet it did not meet the expectations among my guests about what chili should taste like. It didn't look like it. It didn't taste like it. It basically wasn't chili. And it probably left a really bad taste in their mouths, just like, as you'll see today, a bad presentation of a discussion can leave a bad taste in the mouths of the reader. And just like that chili that I made, if you don't know what goes into it, you're bound to make something that doesn't meet with the expectations. So let's look at what goes into chili today. You may recall this mini questionnaire that journal manuscript reviewers are asked to respond to. We've already talked about this here, for example, that the very first question is if the manuscript contains significant information or something new. We've already talked about the method. And now we're going to talk about this question here. Well, at least this question, which is, are the interpretations and conclusions justified by the results? In order to get to that, answer that question, you have to have interpretations, and too often, as you'll see, too often authors who don't have a lot of experience writing will simply provide a recapitulation, another synopsis of what the results were, rather than interpret those results for the reader. And of course, that interpretation is linked directly to the method. Okay. And the other question, too, about reference made to other work in the field is also related, as you'll see. Okay, now you remember this silly commercial about the deodorant. So I say it's silly, but it was actually quite useful in the context of looking at a method section and how the method connects to the introduction section. And there were results. There was a result. There was a winner. That was the result. I can't remember which one it was, but anyway, it was a result. And then if you can imagine this imaginary experiment, if you were to discuss this, you'd have to be able to justify the findings. You have to be able to interpret the findings to the reader. So if this was the method, imagine again that this is the method section. Let's read it again. Men were chosen for the experiment. They said how this is a bad example of a method because you don't say which men, why these men were chosen, and so on. After playing basketball, missing time, each man applied two different deodorants, one on each armpit. A young woman was recruited to judge how pleasing the smell of each deodorant was. The female judge smelled each armpit, each time noting her impressions. Her final analysis was then given based on the notes taken. Okay, this is a really simple and a really poorly crafted method section for the reasons that we already discussed 2 weeks ago. We don't know who the men were, why they were chosen. We don't know why the judge was chosen, if she was trained, if there's any calibration of any instrument, if the instrument was validated, if there was any controlling for key variables such as duration, intensity, and so on, and diet, all of that. Okay, but let's say that this is the method section. Well, all of these questions that I just mentioned and that you sent through Moodle could be asked. What are the ages? How long did they spend evaluating? What was the criterion used? Okay, just so you can imagine that all of these things should go into the method section. And if they did, then it would look something more like this. Men with ages 27 to 39 play basketball for 10 minutes. They applied a roll-on and spray deodorant. So we're talking about which type. They used their criteria described in Smellerson 1993. So, that explaining why it's validated, why it's an instrument that is not just made up out of their heads. The female judge smelled each armpit for exactly 2 seconds, so controlling a variable there, and so on. Okay, so that's a little bit better. Okay. And so the method then, if this were the method, it would necessarily need to tie back to issues raised in the introduction. So, for example, if you mention roll-on and spray deodorant, if there's any literature on roll-on and spray deodorant, then it's something that you probably want to introduce in the introduction, saying that there have been, so-and-so has reported X results for roll-on and so on, so the other person has reported other results for spray, whatever. But these elements that are raised in the method, these variables that can influence the outcome, would likely also be tied into the introduction section. Remember that it's also good to add these kinds of not only what you did, but why you did it. So if you added this, it would make it even better. So in the introduction section, maybe you talk about how the intensity of smelling can influence rating. And so then you put there, to control for intensity, the female judge smelled each armpit for exactly 2 seconds. And all this kind of detail and transparency adds strength to the believability of how you interpret these results in the discussion section. So in the introduction section, you might have something like this, where in the first sentence, you have this claiming of centrality, which is just, here it's just a joke, but give you the idea. And then you have one possible cause of this decline in birth rates is deodorant use among men. Ridiculesky, 2018. Much has been published on the effectiveness of deodorant, yet whether it is better to spray or roll-on type is still unknown. So that's why you have, this would explain why you have in the method section the differentiation between spray and roll-on. Okay, so there are all these questions that you would put, and all of these things could affect the results, all of them. And so naturally, ideally, these are things that should go into your methods section. And therefore, when you present your results, since the method obviously produces the results, any effect that could be caused by any of these things here needs to be put into or controlled for in the method section. Now, once you get to that, once you get to the actual execution of your research, then, well, if the method is problematic, then you might have problematic results. Now, let's say that just 1 or 2 of these questions aren't controlled for in the method section. Let's say, for example, you didn't control for exercise intensity. Well, then that would be something that you're going to have to think about, and you can't go back to the method anymore once you've done the experiment, but you're going to have to think about explaining as a limitation, for example, in the discussion, or explaining how it maybe didn't influence the results. So all throughout, you're going to have your why, even though you have the introduction section of an IMRAD is the why the study is happening, the method is how the study was conducted, the results are what was found, and then the discussion is, okay, so what about the results? Throughout, you're going to have this why, and then how and why did you do it that way? What did you find, and why is it that you found that? And in the discussion, you have so what and why. Why do you think that it's what the and why does it matter? So all of those things will need to be discussed somehow, either in the the introduction section, but then when you talk about your results, you need to discuss those things, all of these questions, as much as possible, either because you did control for them and you want to remind the reader that you did control these things, you did control for these variables, or explain that they weren't looked at and why they weren't looked at. There are many ways of doing that, including just saying, it is a limitation of the study. The more you're transparent about that, the better. And when people get into trouble, one example of how researchers get into trouble is when they are aware of these questions and they don't include them in the discussion section, and they were not part of the method, and therefore, and then sometimes they'll talk as if the results mean the universe, when in fact, clearly there are these questions that are screaming to be answered, and yet the author has not addressed them. That can really weigh negatively on the impression of an article. And this is what was discussed among those several researchers that you saw at the beginning of this course, including these four, Belcher, Bordage, Sullivan, and McKercher et al., where there was a consensus among them that poor discussion can lead to a rejection. Now you're going to know in today's class what a poor discussion means. So let's look at an actual rejection letter. I hope that you never see an actual rejection. It happens, it's not the end of the world, but hopefully that happens to you. And here you have a letter from, this is the cover letter really, this is the letter from the editor, and has answered, has introduced the email like this. In view of the criticisms of the reviewers found at the bottom of this letter, we cannot publish your manuscript in the Anais da Academia Brasileira de Ciências. So this is a Brazilian journal. In the last years, we have received far more papers than we are able to publish. Journalists love saying stuff like this and must make some tough decisions. And it's true, but maybe of little comfort, but that's how they often start. Thank you for considering the Anais da Academia Brasileira de Ciências for the publication of your research. I hope the outcome of this specific submission will not discourage you from the submission of future manuscripts. So really that's the best. I mean, it's a letter that they just kind of copy and paste to everybody. And there are many more of these letters that go out than acceptances. Most cases, over 80% of journal submissions are rejected. And so when you open this kind of email, you might think, okay, why was I rejected? And this is what happens. Here is the actual reason given. The manuscript is interesting and it brings original ideas. However, a major revision is necessary. The methods should be described comprehensively and not confused as it is. Details such as use of water or not to process the mixtures are not mentioned, and this is an important point in this kind of product compositions, mainly due to the true line and phase formation. There are not characteristics of the individual components, as the authors mentioned, that the materials were characterized. The results should justify the interpretations and conclusions. However, they are just pointed out and not discussed at all. Figures 2, 3, and 4 should be standardized scale. Sometimes one of the components is namely referring to paper sludge, sometimes it is namely ETE, sludge hoist, and so on. Language should also be reviewed. Since the manuscript is concerning to technological development, it could present sample image, example, factory circuited. Finally, a very good revision in the manuscript is necessary. And so the answer to why this was rejected is yes. All of these things contributed that you see here. There is something clear about the novelty. So it does say that they understand there's original ideas, but they have problems. They could point out things with the methods. Specifically, it's not clear what they did and how they did it, including things such as not mentioning how they process the mixtures and things like that. All right. Also, they didn't do very good about justifying the interpretations and conclusions. They're just pointed out and not discussed at all. And this is not to fault the author of this paper. The author of this paper that was rejected is in very, very good company. There are so many authors who make the same mistake, and it's rarely the case that just the methods or just problems with the figures or even problems with language will cause the rejection. It's really a kind of confluence. It's in the aggregate that happens. And today we're focusing on this because, a method section is something that, we've talked about this. You can, if how important it is and how important it is to be clear about what you did, then you just do it. You just talk about what you did in a very clear way. You include as much detail as you can. But sections like the introduction and discussion section are tougher. And one of the reasons is that very few people talk about what should a discussion section have in it. How do I discuss? How do I justify the interpretations? And that's why we're doing what we're doing today. This is just highlighting what I just said. So another thing I asked you in Moodle was, why do you think that the introduction section and the discussion sections are so hard? And a lot of you pointed out that they present a more of a challenge because you have to, some of you said, vender seu peixe in the introduction section. That's harder to do. And also in the discussion section, you have to articulate your work with other work. And that is one of the things, yes, that happens in the discussion section. But there's a little bit more to it than that. And so one of the first studies that actually asked scholars about, what they found the most difficult when they're writing was Jean Flowerdeau's study back in 1999 in the context of Hong Kong. And the strategies, categories emerged about what the problems were for them. And one of the highlights was that introductions and discussions are the most problematic parts of research articles for non-native speakers. And then here's why. Within the research article, some parts are found to be more problematic than others. The methodology and results sections are the least problematic, needing only a very conventionalized and formulaic style of writing, right? And not only that, if you know what you did, if you were involved in the research, it's easy to just say, okay, this is what I did. You're reporting. Same thing with the results. You're just reporting. But the most difficult parts, on the other hand, are the introduction, literature review, and discussion conclusion sections. These parts are more problematic because they require a persuasive style of writing in which the individual voice of the author needs to come through. Writers have to convince their readers, including editors and reviewers, in these two sections of the importance of their research and the arguments they are putting forward. So there are difficulties because of the kind of persuasion that has to happen. And also something interesting here about the voice of the author. And so both of those things, though, if you just read this text I just gave you right now, that wouldn't help you because they are in themselves also very vague concepts. How do you persuade? How do you do that? And what do you mean by voice? And so what we're going to talk about here is that what is involved in that persuasion? And what does it mean to have your own voice come through? So let's get down to the chili. That chili recipe that I talked about. There are specific ingredients, and here they are. I break it down into 6 broad categories, 6 main ingredients. First of all, authors in the discussion section tend to refer back to other parts at the beginning. And what you'll see here is I'm presenting these elements in the order in which they often appear in the discussion section. So as one of the first things authors do is refer back to why they did the research, for example, and what they found. It's one of the first moves that are made, is referring back to other things mentioned earlier. Then, at some point after that, often many times, they will interpret those results in the context of what other people have done. So whereas in the introduction section, you are justifying why you did the study in the first place, in the discussion section, you are, and talking about the conversation that your research enters into in the introduction section. In the discussion section, you are justifying the results that you found and connecting it back to the conversation, either the conversation that you introduced in the introduction, or how it converses with other research. Another really common, and this is a bit harder to describe, another common element that is found in the discussion section is elaboration or extrapolation of the results. So basically, saying what the results mean, and adding some information to the results. And it is in this place here, in this adding details, where the author's voice often comes especially through, because you are adding to just the pure data. You're not just talking about the results, not just reporting the results, but you're adding some interpretation for the reader. And so we're going to talk about today and next week how to make that voice and some issues to consider when you're talking about that voice. Another really common thing is this, as represented by this wrench here, is the implication, the practical implication, or the application of your. What does your research results mean in the real world? How can it be used? What problem does it fix? How else can it be applied, either practically or theoretically? What are the implications? Another very common ingredient, and a lot of people believe that they shouldn't include this, but I'm going to tell you right now that it strengthens your research, is to talk about limitations. This is not talking about how your method is problematic, or that your study shouldn't be published because your results are faulty or whatever. It's because every single method has produces results that can be interpreted in more than one way. And so no matter what, there are going to be limitations, and they shouldn't be talked about superficially. In fact, many journals these days actually oblige the authors to include a statement, even in the abstract, about what the limitations are. And then the last element I'll talk about is the way authors will mention how their study and or their results forward the research agenda. What this study does to contribute and further the whole research area that they're looking at. Also, what future research should be, what is still left to do in the study, and this is often the point on which many authors end their papers. So there you have it. There you have the 6 common elements. that's what happens in the discussion section. A good discussion section will have all or most of these. Now we'll look at a few examples of this. So I asked you all in Moodle for today's class to look back at this article that we've looked at before in the context of the introduction, this quantifying the burden of writing research articles in a second language. And you remember that the authors were focusing on one key point, which is the difficulties that non-native English speakers face when writing English is related to a lack of understanding of the genre of the research article, or is there more difficulty because of English itself? So it's because they're unfamiliar with the conventions, or is it because of language? And that was the main thing. And they point that out here. They say, they talk about what has been said before, and then they raise this question. It is an open question to what degree writing science in English as a second language is more difficult than writing science in a first language. And this here is not phrased as a research question, but that is what the research question is, and that is their move too. So when they get to the discussion section, that's what they refer back to. This question of, is it more difficult because of language? This is what you would expect, talking about increased burden because of English. And that's what happens. In the discussion section, they say, the purpose of this investigation was to provide quantifiable data through which the perceived burden of writing a research article in English as a second language could be established. Furthermore, the aim of the study was to address the question, even using the same word here, they bring up in move 2 in the introduction, address the question whether the difficulties in writing a research article in English as a second language were disciplinary, the genre, or linguistic. And so this is revisiting that point. Then they expand, they explain, extrapolate. So they say, the data in this study differentiate between the disciplinary and linguistic aspects of the previously reported studies and support the idea that the added burden of second language science writing is linguistic in nature. This is now the authors speaking. This is them explaining what the results mean to the reader. It's not presenting the results, it's them speaking. As the participants in this study responded in parallel questions to the perceived difficulty, anxiety, and dissatisfaction of writing in their first and second languages, any differences found can only be related to the factor of their perceptions of writing in a second language. In other words, and this is a key adverbial here that signals to the reader that they're continuing this elaboration. In other words, as the disciplinary function of writing a science article is consistent between both questions, it is unlikely that this is the factor that contributed to added burden found in the responses of scientists concerning their second language science writing. The data presented here clearly demonstrate and quantify the self-reported and perceived added burden of writing research articles in English as a second language. So this is them kind of recapping the results, but explaining, expanding, extrapolating. They also say, they acknowledge how this goes into the conversation, how this fits into the conversation. So they say, these findings support the qualitative data presented by other researchers, the difficulties faced by second language scientists, such as those summarized by Usener 2008, Larder 1999, Larder and Lee 2008, St. John 1987, Saliger Meyer 2008, can be attributed to linguistic difficulties as a result of working in a second language. qualitative research with non-Anglophone scholars report greater difficulty in writing quickly, writing appropriately, accessing up-to-date resources, and accessing the networks that facilitate English language publication. What the current study does is to assign these difficulties clearly to the linguistic component and specify the self-reported and perceived degree of increasing burden while supporting the underlying finding of previous studies that English science writing involves difficulty. So in the introduction, where you make it clear what your study is supposed to add, here they talk about how the results add to what's already there. And then they do this move here, which is how the study advances and what is still needed. On a different level, the study also deepens our understanding of the affective dimension of scientific writing. Previous research has addressed this to a limited extent. Sending a manuscript out for peer review always carries some level of anxiety. All articles are manifestly riddled with emotions and emotional risks because work is received within the context not only of intellectual but also emotional acceptance and rejection. Anxiety is mentioned in some studies, including autobiographical accounts of scholarly publishing. As with other results, the findings of the current study differentiate between disciplinary anxiety and anxiety caused by writing science in second language. The scientists in this study report that they do experience anxiety when writing in their first language, but that anxiety jumps up when writing the second. A further contribution of this study is examination. And so it talks about the contributions not only of, in the introduction, you talk about how this contributes, how the study is meant to contribute, but here they talk about even beyond what they intended to look for, what else this contributes to. And importantly, they talk about the limitations. An obvious limitation of the current study is that it focuses on scientists only in Mexico. While the population explored in the study does represent a range of scientific fields and scientists, the fact that they come from Mexico and they speak Spanish may have influenced the results. This acknowledgement is that there's always something that can influence results is very important. In this sense, the findings are limited to the self-reported and perceived burden of Mexican scientists, and perhaps not to all scientists writing in a second language. Accordingly, it would be very helpful if we had similar data that address scientists from a much wider range of countries. It would be especially useful if the same tool were used, which would allow comparable data to emerge. So it even in this sense, even beyond limitations, it actually gives a nod to what else is needed, how future research can use this study. So now you know how to cook your chili. That's basically it. There are plenty of other examples I can show you. I'm not going to go into the detail now because I'm not actually supposed to be speaking very much right now. But these slides are available online, and you can see examples from the discipline of management, of autism, and medicine, and chemistry, and so on. And you can see a bunch of other examples of all those things I just discussed, and you hopefully will now, in your own articles, when you read them, will become more aware of all these things, and you'll notice them in the discussion sections. But before we talk about the final assessment, which is something that I want to get to before we stop, I want to show you how the sections connect. The method section and the results section. And just to exemplify this, I want to go back to our meat consumption study, this rather grotesque image here. And if you recall, the results were these, where they talk about the odor donors and how they conducted analysis of the results, and they used ANOVA, and this is then reported in this rather faulty figure 2, as we've seen. Now, if these are the results, then here are the results depicted graphically here. Then this is the what. Another way to say this is that this is the what of the results. And discussion then is, of course, is the so what. Here in the what, in this graph, there's no interpretation of these things except for inferential statistics. It's not explaining what they mean more broadly, how they converse with others. It's just the what. In the discussion section, then they do. They talk about, they go back to an earlier section, as we've talked about as one of the key ingredients. And the very first thing they do is the results of the study show for the first time that red meat consumption may have a perceivable impact on body odor. This is what the message is here, but there's nothing here about how this is the first time. It's not stated in that way, and here they do state it that way. Then they go on to say odor of donors and omni that were judged as more pleasant, more attractive, less intense. That's exactly what that is. They recap that, the results, and this is their discussion of it. They mentioned about the menstrual cycle, which is something that was brought up in the introduction, and then the method, which influenced the results, and then connects to the discussion. So you can see that really it all connects. So for homework, I'm going to want you to go back to that rejection, the one that you analyzed the rejection letter of, and I want you to look at the actual manuscript and compare the discussion section, just the discussion section of that manuscript to those points that I raised in this. Does it have the 6 ingredients or any of the ingredients? And it's good for you to look at that because it's not a poorly written manuscript in the sense that the English is fine, the language is fine. But there, as the reviewers pointed out, there was an issue with the discussion. So to finalize this class about the discussion, this is obviously going to be available on the slides, but these are some tips that many of you aren't going to have your discussion section ready now, and we're going to talk about that in a second. But when you do one day write your discussion section, these are some tips. Think about how do your findings connect back to the issues raised in the introduction, and how do they connect back to the results? How do your research and results compare to those of other studies that were published previously? Which findings are particularly strong or relevant? What are some possible application implications of your data and results? What are some limitations? This is where you think also critically about your method. What is the main contribution of your research? How does it help advance the field? And what directions for future research are advanced by your study? All those things are questions that you can ask for yourself and try to answer when you get to your discussion section. All right, the big moment, your final assessment. Now, I want to talk about this because we've received some emails from people about final assessment. And a lot of people are worried about that concern that they don't have enough to produce a final assessment. And as I said from the very beginning, it doesn't matter what stage of the research you're at, you're going to be able to submit something. But then recently we revisited that to make it a little bit easier because in essence, a lot of it had to do with the situation in which the situation we're going through right now in the world. So in previous years, I've asked this question, which all of you answered. Hey, buddy. You looking for something?
Yeah.
All right. I'll be done in a minute. And I asked you to fill out this questionnaire. And do you see this first blue bar here? It answers the question, em que fase de elaboração se encontra atualmente sua tese? And it says, nem comecei ainda. And then you have the next one, até 25%. And the point is that in previous years, these were much lower. And the já terminei thing in my 75 were much higher than they are. I think what it is that often when people take this course, they're kind of in the final stages usually of collecting data by the time they get to this point. But since the university and access to, for a lot of people, has changed since early March, there are a lot of people who are not able to collect the data that would normally be able to do. And so therefore, while there are many people that do have enough data and therefore enough material to write an article, there is an even larger number of people who don't have anything really to go on, and they're kind of they're in a very precarious position right now in terms of how much they can write, not only due to the data, but as many of you know, a lot of people have other issues when it comes to being able to execute work in a way that one would normally under non-pandemic conditions. And so I've been toiling with this for some weeks now about how to deal with this, because ultimately I want everybody to feel that they benefit from the course, and so what we've come up with is something that we think that everybody will fit the needs of everybody in the course. And so let me explain to you what we've done. If you access the Moodle, the Amanta, the syllabus is online. It has been since the beginning of the course. And what it had there until today was this. And so this was something that people were very apprehensive about, because a lot of them thought, okay, well, how am I going to write a whole article, blah, blah, blah. All those things I talked about, which is totally understandable. That kind of apprehension happens every year anyway. But in this circumstance, given what has happened this year, people are even more apprehensive about it. And so now that's been changed. That is no longer there in the on the syllabus. The syllabus has been altered. This is a Google Doc, so it's changeable. And now, instead of that, you have something called Análise de artigo. This análise of artigo can be your article or another article, as I'll explain in a minute. This is going to be due on September 10th at 5 o'clock. And as you'll see in a minute, you can get started on this sort of right away. And what you'll see is in module 12, so this is going to be on September 3rd, you have this module. You're going to have two options. You'll be able to upload your own article if you have one that is complete or almost complete. You can upload that. Or if for whatever reason that's just not feasible, you can upload a published article of your choice, for example, a mentor text. So you upload your own article or another article that you choose, just one. That's what you're going to do by the end of this. Okay, that'll be the first step, is to identify either if you're going to use your own article, which is probably the best thing to do. If that's not possible, then you can choose another article that that you will decide on. We're not going to judge which article you choose. In either case, what you're going to do is you're going to provide an analysis, a detailed analysis of those articles, of your article, whichever one you choose. And you're going to identify at least 5 elements in the article that reflect points that were highlighted during this course. So we're going to have 12 total modules. You just have to choose elements from all those modules and identify them in the text. So, for example, you could include parts of the text that clearly show move to in cars, or a good example of the use of authorial voice. A good example of making it a concession, which is, you're going to see that next week. A good example of hedging, and you're going to see that next week as well. A good example of an effective title, a good example of a well-structured abstract, and so on. You also have the option of choosing a bad example if you want, but you have to comment on that. In either case, what it's going to look like is you're going to upload the article, either your article or another article, and then you will choose the element. So, for example, a title. And you give that a label just like this. You'll say, okay, it's a good title. I'm choosing one element as a good title. Then, this is important, you need to copy and paste the actual text that fits this thing that you're saying is an element that represents something that you learned on the course. And then comment on that. So why did you choose that? Why do you think that's a good title? You say, oh, this is a good example of a effect of X on Y title that clearly shows the point of the study. That's all you need. Another element, an example of hedging, and then you have the text and then a comment. An example of element 3, claiming centrality, and then you have the exact text that shows what you mean, what you think is claiming centrality, and then commenting on why you chose that and why you think that is a good example of claiming centrality. Or a bad example, if you want to choose a bad example, that's fine too, just as long as you comment on it. In either case, you got to make sure that you upload the article, the source text, and you're going to write this in a text box. So when you get to this module, you're going to click on this, of course. You're going to click on the final assessment. And then you're going to click on this add submission. When you do that, then you get 2 submission boxes. One is the online text box. The other one is for files. In the online text box, you're going to write your elements, the label of the element, the actual text that you copy and paste, and then your comment. You're going to put all that there. And then you must not forget to also include the source text in the file. So you'll end up with something like this. So you write in your 5, remember it's 5 elements that you choose for your analysis. Include the text and include your comment and include your source file. Both those things make up the assignment. Without both those things, your assignment will be considered incomplete. Then you finally will save changes, which is your confirmation of the submission, and that's it. This assessment will be available on September 3rd because I want you to pay attention to what we're going to say next week and the subsequent weeks, because there are other things that will be relevant that you may want to choose to put in that assignment. Nonetheless, as I've shown you what this is all about, you can already start doing that now. You can already start identifying, thinking about, are you going to use your article or another article? And then you can already start identifying the elements, key elements that have been focused on during this course that you want to include in your analysis that you will submit in September. And you'll have, from September 3rd, you'll have 7 days to complete it. And that's it. Right. So that's it for me today. Sorry if I talked really funny today, but that's what happens when you put off going to the dentist because of the pandemic. And I hope that you're happy with the final evaluation. I think it's something that I feel much better about, because I knew that in good conscience I couldn't ask people to do what they've done in previous years. So I hope that works out, and I wish you a good rest of the week, and we'll see you then.